Welcome to this module, Learner Development and Characteristics Overview. This module is part of the Inclusive Education Paraprofessional Training Series. In this module, we'll address some of the key paraprofessionals' roles and responsibilities. One of the big ones we're going to focus on is how do we help highlight students' strengths? So we're going to talk about this idea of a strengths-based approach to students. Then moving down, we'll talk about some active participation and direct instruction in Module 2B, particularly how we make adaptations to support students to participate in classroom activities, how we attend to their behavior and check in with them, and then also how we help promote positive interactions between students with disabilities and their peers and classroom teacher. But first, we'll start with more of an overview looking at disability labels and their function in schools. So our first objective is to understand the benefits and potential harms of using disability labels in schools. Second, we want to recognize dignifying language when we refer to students with disabilities. So our agenda, first I'll introduce the categories of eligibility for special education in the state of New Jersey. Then I'll talk about some of the potential benefits, but also harms of the use of these disability labels in schools. And third, I'll give some examples of language that are commonly used when referring to students with disabilities and what we should keep in mind when we're using language in schools. So first of all, we have the categories of eligibility here on the screen. These are the 14 categories that are used in the state of New Jersey. At any point, you can stop and research a little bit more if you're interested in one of these categories to understand the definition or look for more specific examples of it. But I do want to at least start off by making a couple key points. So first, you may notice that some of the categories refer to more specific disabilities, whereas most of them refer to broader categories. So let's give some examples. First of all, autism is one that would probably very closely align with a diagnosis that a student might have. For example, a student may have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and they may be eligible for special education services under the category of autism if it's determined that that disability is negatively impacting their education after an evaluation is conducted. But if we look at other categories, like intellectual disability, that's more of an umbrella term. There are a number of different specific disabilities or conditions that might fall under this. For example, Down syndrome or Fragile X syndrome. A student with either one of those conditions may receive services under intellectual disability. Other health impaired is another broad category. A big one there is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is the most common childhood disorder. Many students with ADHD do receive services under the category of other health impaired, but there's also other aspects such as diabetes or epilepsy. Those are other conditions that could fit under the category of other health impaired. Specific learning disability is another big category in special education, but again, that is an umbrella term. So there are specific disabilities that a student might have that might fit under specific learning disability, for example, dyslexia or dysgraphia. It's also important to know that if a student has a co-occurring disability, for example, a student who has ADHD and a learning disability, they may receive services under specific learning disability, even though they also have ADHD. So I bring this to your attention so you're aware that when educators talk about students in schools, they may refer to them by the specific diagnosis that they have, such as, for example, Down syndrome, or they may refer to them as the category of eligibility, such as intellectual disability, or you may hear both. What's also important to know about these is why they're useful. So I mentioned that they provide eligibility for services in special education in schools, but they also facilitate services outside of schools. That can be important, particularly as students are getting older and they're transitioning. And as a student with a disability, now they're getting community services that's going to help them to transition for life after high school. So that's important as well. It's also important because these labels help researchers to study the impact of different characteristics in research. So what folks will do is group together different students based on their disability labels and similar characteristics, and then study them. For example, study the impact of a reading intervention on students who have a learning disability, and then report the results of that. It's also useful because these disability labels provide a common language with which to convey information widely and efficiently. So what that means is, for you, it's possible you may find yourself looking up a disability diagnosis that you're not familiar with that a student has, and you'll likely be able to find information very quickly online because we have a common language to refer to all these different disabilities. But there are also some potential harmful effects of disability labels. The first is that sometimes when a student gets a label of a disability, it becomes this sort of defining characteristic where they get referred to always by their disability, and they're always kind of thought of as having this disability rather than being thought of as an individual student first. It also may lead folks to assume that children with the same label are all alike when they are in fact very different from each other. So even two students who have the same label of autism, they may be very different in terms of their needs. And we don't want to make an assumption necessarily that they have the exact same needs just because they have the same disability label. It's also important that we avoid deficit-based views of the student. So just because a student has a disability, that may sometimes lead them to be talked about or thought of in terms of what they can't do, what their inability is. And so much so that we might not see their strengths because we're so focused on what they're not able to do. And that's something that we want to be aware of. And lastly, this can lead to stigma or sort of a negative identity and low expectations for the students' future. So if they become seen because of their label as not being able to have as much of a bright future, then they might not get the same opportunities as other students. And that's something we want to be careful of as well. So how can we sort of avoid some of these potential pitfalls? Well, think about this. If you were providing support to a student who didn't have a disability, how would you figure out the best ways to support them? Think about that for a moment. You can pause the video if you'd like. So I'll suggest some general ideas for how we understand students. First, we want to recognize that all students are individuals regardless of their disability labels. That's really important. We also want to observe and get to know them as individuals, particularly to learn their interests and learn their preferences as a student. So we want to take note, what is a comfortable learning environment for them? What is it about their sensory, physical environment where they tend to be more comfortable versus not as comfortable? And we want to take note of that. When do they seem to feel motivated? Maybe we notice in certain classes that they tend to be more motivated and engaged in activities, and other times they're not. We want to try to take notice of what's going on when they are more successful, when they are more motivated, get to know them in that way. It's also important to presume that students may be more capable of more than what others have assumed. In other words, because there is that bias sometimes that a student with a disability, we tend to look at them by what they can't do. Folks in the past may not have seen something that this student is capable of, a strength that they do have. And it's important that we keep an eye out for those things and keep an open mind to what a student may be capable of, and not just make assumptions based on past information or based on their labels. And lastly, we want to get to know the tools that support their success. This could be, for example, students who use assistive technology, low tech or high tech. We want to understand how those tools work and how they support them, and that we can ensure that we're able to help students to use the tools to the maximum potential so that they can support the students to do well. I want to give some examples now of language that's used to describe disability. On the screen here, I have several examples, and I'll just highlight a few terms that are sometimes used to describe students with disabilities in schools. For example, at the top right, we have special needs students, or moving clockwise, special education kid, or LD students, IEP student. What you may notice about a lot of this different language is that they tend to refer to the child according to their disability or according to the fact that they receive special education services. So the student kind of becomes defined by their disability or defined by special education. That's something that we really want to be aware of and steer away from. So I'll talk in a minute about how we can use different language that moves away from this type of approach. It's also important, though, that we consider avoiding euphemisms. So euphemisms refer to when a student, when we use language to describe a student that sort of substitutes a word for something that maybe we feel like we don't want to refer to because it might be perceived as negative. So for example, we might say special needs student instead of a student with a disability, or exceptional student instead of a student with a disability. But these terms, even if they're well intended, can sometimes actually reinforce some negative ideas that are harmful to students. For example, the idea that a student has special needs, well, that kind of makes us think that their needs are something that's really unusual, unexpected, not normal, when in fact, we could just think of that student as having needs, just like any other student has needs, and it's our job to create an environment that meets their needs. Their needs themselves are not special, they're just needs. So another way that we can move away from euphemisms is to focus more on person-first language that just talks about the student, what their needs are, what they do to be successful, as talking about the student first or the person first. So some examples of this: student who uses a wheelchair, student who has a disability, student who receives special education services. So if we look at that third one, no longer are they the special education kid or the special education student, they're just a student, and they also happen to receive special education services to support their success. Lastly, be aware that some students may actually prefer identity-first language, such as the idea that I'm disabled or I'm autistic. That's not person-first language, that's different. But we want to be aware that some students may come to identify with their disability in really personal ways, where they come to think of themselves as, I'm an autistic person or I'm a disabled person. If they do come to identify like that, it's important that we respect that idea. 2 deeper dive activities for this module. First, you can look at the Not Special Needs video, which is individuals with disabilities talking about why we should move away from the idea of special needs. And then activity 2 is a short reading that talks about the problem with disability euphemisms, like the language that I talked about earlier. Here are the references for this module. And thank you for your attention.